Hello world, welcome to The Frizzle Factor. I'm Joanne Waston, your resident Miss Frizzle. I love cool science, cool critters, and cool classrooms. I want to foster collaboration between science and education so we can all help to increase science literacy in our communities. Join me as I interview scientists, professionals, and enthusiasts in talking about our journeys and the things we love about the world around us. First off, let's start with who are you and what do you do in regards to science?
So my name is Remington Moll, and I am currently a research associate at Michigan State University, and I study wildlife biology. So I study how animals use landscapes, how they interact with each other and with humans, and I focus my work on areas that are highly urbanized, like cities, so wildlife living inside cities, as well as places outside of cities like national parks. And I like to compare how the wildlife are living in those two places.
So, what is an interest or hobby that you have that's unrelated to science?
Well, I have 3 young kids, so I don't know if raising kids is a hobby, but it's what I spend a lot of time on. I play a lot of Legos with my kids, so that's fun. I'm a musician. I'm into music a lot. I play guitar and piano and sing on a very amateur level, but it's an outlet outside of science that I enjoy a lot.
Yeah, no, that's great. It doesn't matter if you're good. What matters is the process, right?
That's right.
If your path to this point, where you are now, was a checklist or a series of steps, what would that be? And I always give the caveat that it's all right if it's not necessarily the most expedient or what you would tell someone else to do, but just kind of give us an idea of what brought you to the point that you're at now.
Yeah, my pathway into science was not very straightforward. I went to university at the University of Missouri, and I went there. I was recruited to run track and field, so I was on the track and field team, and that was really my primary interest was athletics, and I had to get a degree along the way. So I started as an English education major. I wanted to be a teacher. But after a couple semesters, I really started to think about what it was I wanted to study. And I essentially studied the course guide at the university and picked the major that had the coolest sounding classes, which ended up being fisheries and wildlife. And then once I got into those courses, I really loved them. Going out and doing field work, learning about the natural world, learning about the scientific process. It was exciting to me and something I enjoyed. However, I was still mostly focused on athletics. But then I got injured, kind of re-examined some of the things I was doing. And what happened was I was injured for a period of time, and I applied to get another year with which to use my eligibility to compete in track and field. And so in order to complete that extra year, I had to be enrolled in a graduate program. And so kind of by force, I entered graduate school. I mean, I was interested in it, but it wasn't really my passion. So I started a master's degree at the University of Missouri in wildlife science with a mentor that I'd been working with there, and really loved it. I really enjoyed the graduate experience. It was more hands-on. It was more writing and reading and thinking rather than just taking courses, and had success in it. So that was when I really realized that I could do this as a career, and maybe I wouldn't make the Olympics, so I had to have a fallback plan. But then my course took another fairly dramatic turn in that I was newly married. My wife and I had always talked about wanting to live overseas, and an opportunity came up for us to work for an NGO that did social and educational development work in the Middle East.
Okay.
Yeah, and so I was kind of on the academic track, going to do a PhD and go into research, but this opportunity came up, and we felt like it was the right time and the right thing to do. So we moved overseas to Jordan.
Oh, wow.
For several years, and I was a teacher over in the Middle East. My wife's a nurse. She did medical clinics. We worked mostly with Syrian refugees because that was when the Syrian war broke out. And so we were over there for a total of 5 years. Like I said, not very straightforward. But as we were over there, I kind of realized that long term I wanted to go back and do a PhD. And so I contacted some people doing research in the States. And very ironically, that the overseas experience actually, I think, really helped me understand not just who I was and what I wanted to do, but it also connected me with a really great advisor and I think helped my research project a lot. And so I came back, did my PhD at MSU in wildlife ecology, and here I am today.
Wow, that's a great story. I kind of resonate with how you were thinking about doing English education. I mentioned this on a few of the other podcasts, but my road was also kind of twisty, and I thought going in that I really liked education, and I thought the only subject I was good at was English. But then I realized I didn't want to study that for years. And so it wasn't really until I came into another subject, which was ecology, working with at a wildlife rehab and kind of deciding that, if I'm going to go back to school, I want it to be kind of the fun animals, doing fun stuff with animals.
Right.
So that's kind of how I went there. And that's really cool that you went overseas and did some education work. I imagine that some of your education work has translates well, perhaps to being a professor. I think sometimes there's kind of a misconception, or sometimes this just happens where some people end up in research institutions because that's where the research is happening, but maybe they're not as familiar with the education side. So I just wanted to, I know this isn't on the list, but I was just curious about your own perspective about how your interest maybe in education maybe has helped you in the spot that you're at right now.
That's a great question. It was really interesting to me to teach in another culture and to think about what education means in different contexts. One of the things that it made me think about a lot was just the focus of educators on developing students as people and not just conveying information. And what I mean by that is helping them helping them find who they are, helping them learn how to be responsible, learn how to be consistent, and to teach skills that are translatable regardless of what field you go in, whether that's critical thinking skills, quantitative or writing skills.
Mm-hmm.
So I really see all of my experiences in education as very applicable to the current situation I find myself in. And I think it's really helped me as an educator think about students as people who are dynamic and have varied interests. The other thing I took away from it really is talking about twisty pathways. Everybody has a different path, and almost always that path is unpredictable. I think that's kind of helped me in the classroom recognize that people are taking classes for different reasons. They're on different career tracks for different reasons, and those reasons are going to change over time. And so again, it really highlights the importance of thinking of how can we as educators help students develop not just in the subject matter, but in critical skills and as people.
Mm-hmm. I totally agree. I think that's a really great reminder, helpful to remember. So let's delve a little bit more into the science of what you're doing. So what does your current research entail?
I presently am focused on two primary projects. One of them is an urban ecology project that's based in Cleveland, Ohio. And I don't know if many people realize this about Cleveland, Ohio, but they have an absolutely amazing urban park system called the Cleveland Metro Parks. There's 18 parks, over 20,000 acres.
Oh, wow.
It's used there. I think they have something like 15 or 16 million annual visits per year. And so there's a lot of human use of these parks, but the parks are also home to a really wide variety of wildlife, including coyotes, red foxes, of course, raccoons, possums, and then they have a very diverse bird community that uses the parks, especially in the summer, as they're coming up to the United States to breed in their summer breeding season. And so that project's really focused on trying to understand how these wildlife live in the city, in the context of city parks, and how they interact with both urban landscapes, where there's tons of buildings and roads, and with all the people that use those parks. The other project that I'm actively pursuing is one in Western Nevada. And this system is quite different. It's not very urbanized. It's much more wild. And it's focused on the carnivore community in the western part of Nevada. So this would be near the Lake Tahoe region, in kind of the Reno area. So black bears have historically been in Nevada in very high numbers. Those numbers dropped a lot in the early part of the 1900s, and they've rebounded. And so now there's about 400 to 500 black bears living in that area, and we're studying that population in particular. But there's also a diverse carnivore community. So there are mountain lions, there are coyotes, there are gray foxes, kit foxes, bobcats. And so we're trying to understand how all these species coexist with one another, because they often compete. They're often eating the same species and competing for space. And so we're looking at some of those dynamics in the West. And then the third area of my work focuses mostly on international collaboration. Our research lab here at Michigan State has a focus on wildlife conservation in Eastern Africa. So I've collaborated on projects in Uganda and Tanzania, mostly looking at how carnivores interact with their prey in those landscapes and how that affects people living in and around those areas. So, for example, I collaborated on a project that focuses on pastoralist livestock. So these are mostly cattle that people take out to graze on a daily basis, but the lands in which they're grazing these cattle are also inhabited by hyenas, African lions, which occasionally will target those cattle as prey. And so thinking about how those dynamics play out and whether or not these cattle are changing their behavior in order to avoid being detected by lions, or whether certain practices that the people are using in those landscapes can help mitigate some of the risk of lions taking their cattle. And some of those issues are also components of my research, but in a more collaborative effort.
That's really interesting. I like how you mentioned when talking about education that you like to think of skills that can apply across, and you're certainly working in a bunch of diverse situations, so it is helpful to have skills that can apply to those very diverse areas. It's interesting. So, what is a common misconception that you've encountered from others toward your area of research specifically, or your work in general?
I think there's maybe a couple I'd like to mention. One would be that I think often people don't realize how quantitative wildlife biology is. And what I mean by that is there's a lot of data analysis that goes into the research, which involves a lot of programming and statistical expertise. Wildlife are really hard to study. Nature is really complex, and to try to understand what's going on, there's a lot of effort spent on using really advanced statistical models that require a lot of training. So that's one area. The other, I don't know if this is a misconception, but I think maybe it's underappreciated, which is thinking about urban parks as real natural places. In other words, the wildlife that live in and around cities are just as wild as the wildlife living, in a national park somewhere. And so thinking about biodiversity or wildlife conservation in urban systems in the same way that you would think of it as, thinking of a place like Yellowstone National Park. I think it's important for people to really appreciate the wildlife that is all around them in cities. And I think that's really crucial, especially in the modern world where the majority of people worldwide live in cities. And so what that means is your baseline average experience of nature, if you're a human living on planet Earth occurs in the context of a city. And so I think it's important to think about city parks as real habitat, as hosting wild populations that are diverse and interesting, just like areas outside the city.
Yeah, I totally agree. This past fall, so fall 2019, I was a student teaching at a high school, and in our environmental science class, we got to participate with the Mammal, collaborating with Smithsonian Conservation Biology Institute, and doing stuff with Snapshot USA on kind of a nationwide camera trap survey. And it was crazy. They didn't believe me when I said that we would find in the middle of the city animals, and big animals too, not just squirrels, but actually foxes and bobcats and coyotes. And so that school is like right in the middle of the city. It kind of backs up some of the areas to just a business strip along in the middle there. And we had some pictures, some of our most diverse plots were like right behind the backyard of the AutoZone, right in this little kind of unused fragment. And so these kids were mind blown by that. And I think a lot of people don't realize, as you said, that there are wild animals very near to where people live. And I think sometimes we think it's out there, and we often want to do the studies out there. Like teachers in urban areas might not think that they can do some of these things, like checking on animals, but they can. So I think that's really cool.
There's a quote I always refer to when talking about this by Aldo Leopold, who was kind of, some people call him like the father of wildlife management. And he said, we grieve only for what we know. It's really important in the context of urban ecology, in the sense that if people don't realize that these species are all around them, they would never know if these species were lost. And so just bringing that to light, I think, is really valuable, and it's fun to know that you're sharing a city with these really interesting creatures.
Yeah. So if possible, I have some ideas, but I'm curious from your perspective, how do you think some teachers and science communicators could help to alleviate some of these misconceptions? So whether that's thinking wrongly that wildlife biology is more frou-frou, that it's not as quantitative, or that there's not as much wildlife really to be examined in urban areas. How would you maybe go about alleviating some of these misconceptions?
Yeah, well, I love the experience that you just shared, where you are in a classroom but also contributing to a broader citizen science research project. And so I think citizen science is really one way to immerse students in the scientific process in a very real way, because citizen science is something that anybody can do and is really valuable for researchers. So getting kids, whether it's younger kids or older high school students, hooked up with active researchers in the area, I think is a fantastic way to get involved.
Yeah, and dovetailing on that, what sort of techniques do you use now that you think would be easily translatable to just the average person listening, or teachers, or students?
Well, the one you mentioned, I think, is a great one, which is using camera traps. Almost anybody can put out these motion sensor camera traps in their backyard or in a natural space, and come home and check them and see what they've got pictures of or videos of, which I think is a really exciting way to get involved. Just as you mentioned, I taught a class last semester that we put out camera traps around Michigan State University's campus, and one of the ones we put right next to the building had this beautiful gray fox on it within the first week. So that is a very easy and straightforward way, I think, to get started. Another thing that I've tried, which is kind of fun, I've worked some with small mammals. This would be rodents, deer mice, that kind of thing, voles. We've put out what we call track tubes, which are like, basically, if you picture a rain gutter on a house, but it has a gutter on the bottom and a gutter on top. So it's like a tube that you can open. And inside that tube, you place sticky, transparent paper and two ink wells on either side. And so when mice or anything small runs through that tube, they step on the ink, it gets on their paws, and then they leave paw prints. And you can look at those paw prints and try to determine what kind of species were there. So that would be another fun thing to try. Or more simply than that, if you live in a place that gets snow, to go out and look at wildlife tracks in the snow and try to identify them, I think is also a great way to get out into the field and try to see science in action on the ground in the field.
That's cool. Yeah, those are great ideas. Now I'm going to try them. So, well, maybe not the snow thing. I don't think I can do that here in Georgia, but
Right.
So what is something unexpected you discovered along the way about your science journey or area of research in particular? So this could be anywhere from childhood to now. What was something that was kind of like, oh, surprise?
I've been constantly surprised at just how complex nature is. One of the areas that I've done research in are interactions between predators and prey.
Mm-hmm.
And especially working in areas like I mentioned, Western Nevada or Eastern Africa, you have these ecosystems that have all these different predators. In East Africa, you have spotted hyenas and African lions and leopards and cheetahs. In the States, you have communities of mountain lions and black bears and coyotes, bobcats, red foxes, gray foxes. And the ways in which these animals coexist with one another, despite sometimes overlapping in space using the same areas,
Mm-hmm.
sometimes eating the same kinds of prey or food items, the ways that they can coexist and carry on are just so intricate that they're really challenging to study, but it's really rewarding it's like a giant puzzle to try to figure out how these animals are living out there in the landscape.
Yeah, no, I think that's something. So, in my undergraduate, what really got me and stuck me into ecology was a conservation biology professor who did camera traps in the class that we took. And that kind of got me hooked. And I ended up doing research with him on mammals in the southeast and particularly looking at carnivore communities. And it was just wild to me to just think about these different animals and then thinking about how they partition space and time. And I was also surprised just by some of the facts that I didn't know, like bobcats. I didn't realize that they didn't have very good eyesight. You kind of just assume some things about these animals because you relate them to the thing that you know close. You're thinking cat, it's just like a cat, but it's so much more than just a regular cat. And so it is really fun to kind of learn about those things that we think are more normal than they are.
Right.
And so, going a little bit deeper, what is something unexpected you discovered along the way about yourself?
Well, one thing that I learned about myself was, I mean, I think I knew this, but it became more apparent over time, is that I really have broad research interests. I'm interested in a bunch of different things. There's a tendency, I think, to want to specialize in one thing, and I think this is pretty common in the research world. You kind of pick a sub-discipline and you devote your research career to it, and you go really deep in it. And I think there's tremendous value in that. But I just wasn't able to stay only on one topic. So I was interested in all different species. I was interested in urban areas and wild areas. And some people, I think, have difficulty understanding that because they want to, they might want to put you in a box, or they just might want a way to think about what you do as a scientist that's simple and makes sense to them. And I had this interaction with a mentor of mine where he was saying, it might be wise for you to specialize. It might make yourself more marketable. And he used this analysis or this analogy of Usain Bolt, the Jamaican sprinter, where he said, Usain Bolt could have been a good long jumper, but he had to really focus on the 100-meter dash to become the very best he could possibly be and not do other events. And I thought about that for a long time, and I kind of realized that I think if we're drawing analogies to athletes, I think I'm more like a decathlete. Who does a bunch of different stuff and tries to do them all well. And so that was something that brought me a lot of ease about my own research identity and things I focused on, and really has allowed me to work across a diversity of projects, and that's been really energizing for me.
I think that's really helpful. I'm also someone who's just very scattered and doesn't know what to do if I go on to grad school, so it's part of why I just stopped while I was ahead before I dove in. So
right.
I think that's helpful.
There is a fine line, but you can't get overstretched, right? The truth is you can't do everything, but trying to find out, that sweet spot of where you're at your best, it takes a lot of time, and I'm still trying to understand that after being in it for many years.
So the next question maybe goes with a little bit with that. So what is a misconception about being a scientist or the scientific method or process that you would like to challenge? So more specifically about being a scientist, what's a misconception in that area?
That's a really interesting question. I think of what a scientist is. There's a scientist, a biologist named Brian McGill, who wrote about this, and I like his definition. He said that a scientist is just someone who measures things. If you go out and measure things and look at them in an analytical way, that's really what the scientific method is all about. And I think that's right, but something that goes beyond that is being a scientist, you realize just how human the scientific process is. And what I mean by that is, scientists, it's true that we try to be objective and we do measure things in objective ways, but ultimately those objective data that we collect have to be interpreted, they have to be synthesized, they have to be written about and understood by humans. And so I really view the scientific process more these days as a conversation that evolves over time and eventually hopefully converges on the truth, rather than an error-free method that's purely objective. And I don't say that at all to disparage the process. I think the scientific method is a tremendous way to approach the world and to gather truth about it, but recognizing that it is people that are doing the science, and the importance of critical thinking and interpreting data and presenting data in a responsible manner is really, really crucial, and something that I think it's hard to maybe appreciate from the outside.
So you talked a little bit about your role in education, but what kind of role does science communication play in your life right now?
Well, right now, most of my work is in the academic world, so I spend a lot of time doing research, writing research publication for scientific journals. But in terms of broader communication, I enjoy social media. I enjoy reaching out primarily through Twitter and posting. Mostly, it's cool pictures of animals from our research, just to let people know, what's going on and spark those conversations. Honestly, a lot of my science communication happens with my kids. So I have 3 daughters. One's a newborn, so there's not a lot of communication going on, but the others are 6 and 9. And just really talking with them about what I do and showing them pictures of the animals that I'm studying, trying to really explain my research to a 6 or a 9-year-old, I think is really helpful. And they gather around the computer while I'm working at home, programming code or writing papers. And so just discussing the scientific process with them, I think it's really rewarding for me, and I think it's really formative for them, seeing how it works, and hopefully being inspiring to them as they grow up.
That's awesome. Yeah, I think that is helpful. So not only are people often taught that if you can teach it, it. But I think there's a special skill in teaching to someone whose level is much lower. So certainly teaching to children is a helpful way of even helping oneself to kind of reframe and think about what they're actually doing and how they're going through the process. So that's cute. So zooming in a little bit more on the education part. So in retrospect, what was your relationship to science, be it in classes or experiences in general growing up? And kind of off of that, when did the light bulb kind of turn on? So were you someone who was always interested in science, or was there a class or a situation that kind of brought you to that?
Yeah, I wasn't always interested in science. I wasn't disinterested, but it wasn't really until late in college that I started to think about a career in science. And so, I don't know, I think that's maybe encouraging to people who are still exploring the idea of a scientific career. It took me quite a while, and I'm not sure if I had a light bulb moment, but I did. When I was in college, I did make a decision to enter the field of wildlife biology, and as I mentioned before, that was primarily motivated by wanting to take classes that sounded really fun, whether that was ornithology, going out and studying birds, or dendrology, learning about trees, how to identify them. I would read through those course materials and think, I could actually do this as a degree and as a job. That sounded just fantastic for me. And then once I did start on that path, I really, really enjoyed it. I still remember going out for my very first ornithology lab, field lab. So going out and birding, identifying birds, trying to listen to their calls and identify them. And I had no idea what I was doing. But just being out there with other people who are really passionate about nature and about understanding how animals work and live, and being able to take that as a course, it was a really wonderful experience for me. So that, I guess that's the closest to a light bulb moment that I had.
I feel like I was kind of there too, and that's something that I want to stress in my future classroom is just that exposing children to the idea that there are jobs out there for which you can get paid a salary and benefits to just go out and play with fish or mark a trail or do something kind of like that. And so I think that's a host of possibilities that not a lot of people realize are out there.
Right.
So I guess just thinking more specifically, was there any positive science experience growing up that you had? Or I guess really you've talked a lot about in college how you kind of got to just experience those cool science classes. So maybe was there another experience that you just thought was just a really good one, a good example?
Yeah, there's a couple. One of them, part of my interest in urban ecology was really formulated when I was training for cross country and track in high school. And every week we would go on Sunday, we would go do our long run. Part of our training regimen was to do a longer run, maybe 10 miles or 12 miles. And we would meet at the largest urban park in Tulsa, Oklahoma, where I grew up, which was called Turkey Mountain. We go run through the forest for, an hour or an hour and a half. And that was an experience that was really, I think it was really good for my mental health, and just being out in nature, exercising in an urban context was really refreshing. So that was part of it. And then in high school, I had really great science teachers. I had one project in particular which stands out to me, where in 10th grade we had to go out, this is for biology class, we had to go out and find, I think it was 25 different species of trees and identify them, and then we had to take a picture in front of them to prove that we actually found them in the city and where they were located. And so we were driving all over town, looking for all these trees and taking pictures in front of them. And then we put together this notebook full of the experience that we turned in. And that was something that it was an experience. So it was very memorable. It wasn't studying something in a book or in the classroom. You were out doing things. And that really stuck out to me. And I think it really formed my idea that, to get people to really learn on a deep level, experiences are key.
Yeah, I totally agree. You can be exposed to so many more experiences. You don't know what you don't have or you've never seen before. So that's a good starting point. So thank you very much for being here. But I do have one final question. And that's simply, what general advice would you give to a kid or even an adult who's listening right now and wondering about pursuing a similar path?
Well, I would say, I really love the idea of process over product. And so thinking about, there's this quote by Cervantes where he said, "The journey is better than the end." And maybe it's a little cheesy, but I think it's true. And so a lot of people talk about, try to find what you're passionate about, and that's important, or try to find what you're good at, and I think that's important too. But really embracing the journey over the end destination is really key. And the reality is most of us end up in places that we didn't really expect or we couldn't predict. And so to really dive into the journey and enjoy every experience as you go is the advice that I would give.
If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe and leave a positive review on my podcast through your favorite podcast viewing platform. You can view the liner notes and find related resources on my website, frizzlefactor.com. There, I have a growing backlog of free and affordable lesson materials and links to my YouTube channel where I go more into the process of translating science into the classroom setting and helping teachers to modify ideas for their own classrooms.